Story number 1. The Forgotten Town. Daniel Reynolds had always been the type of man who sought adventure in the simple things: a road trip, a clear sky, the open road ahead. But this trip, one that began like every other, would take him somewhere unexpected, somewhere that would change him forever. It was on a narrow, winding road in the middle of nowhere that he saw it, the town. A sign stood crooked, half covered by creeping vines, the letters barely legible. Eaton's Hollow, it read. He didn't know why he felt compelled to pull off the road, but he did. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as he turned into the small, seemingly abandoned town. The streets were empty, not a soul in sight. Daniel parked near the center of town, the buildings standing like ghostly sentinels in the silence. The paint was peeling off the old storefronts, windows cracked or covered in grime, the kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of a forgotten ghost town. But it was still something faintly alive. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the cracked pavement as he moved down the street. There was a chill in the air, one that he couldn't shake despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. The town felt empty, but not silent. No, it was as if there was a faint hum just beneath the surface, like the pulse of a heartbeat too faint to hear. He approached the first building, an old diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. The door creaked as he opened it, the air stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. And yet, there were signs of life. A coffee pot, half full, sat on the counter, the sound of a clock ticking from the back room. He wasn't alone. "Can I help you, sir?" The voice was soft, almost too soft, coming from behind him. Daniel turned to see a woman standing at the entrance. She looked tired. Her clothes were outdated, and her face was pale, worn. But her eyes, they were strange, vacant, as if they were staring at him, yet seeing nothing. It was a look he couldn't quite place, something distant, detached. "Just passing through," Daniel said with a polite smile, unsure of what else to say. She didn't smile back. "You should be careful here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why's that?" The woman paused, her gaze flickering to the corner of the room, as though she were waiting for something. Or someone. "We're all waiting," she muttered. "Waiting for what?" Daniel asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the back of the diner. Something about the way she spoke, the way she moved, made him feel uneasy, as though he was intruding in a place that was not meant for him. Daniel left the diner and continued to explore the town. Every shop he passed, every person he met, they all seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had walked into the middle of a play, one where everyone knew their lines except him. And then there was the clock, ticking in every room, in every shop, a constant reminder that time was passing, but nothing was changing. The longer Daniel stayed, the more he began to notice the odd details. No one aged, no one laughed, no one cried. They all stood in place, as if frozen in a moment that they couldn't escape. He wandered further into the town, his curiosity pulling him toward the old church at the end of the street. The door was ajar, creaking as it swayed in the wind. Inside, there were no pews, no altar. Instead, a large mural covered the entire wall behind the pulpit. The mural was strange, depicting a scene of people, the townsfolk, their faces twisted in anguish, their bodies bound by chains. At the center of it all stood a dark figure, obscured in shadow, its face a blur, but its eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. Daniel stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the center of the mural, was his face, staring back at him. A voice, soft and almost unrecognizable, whispered from behind him, "You shouldn't have come." Daniel spun around, his heart racing, but no one was there. The air felt heavier now, pressing against him from all sides. He ran outside, his mind spinning with questions. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening to him, to the people of this town. But the more he searched, the more he realized the truth. Eaton's Hollow wasn't abandoned. It was trapped, stuck in a never-ending cycle of waiting. And Daniel was a part of it now, just like them. It wasn't just the people who were waiting. It was the town itself. Every street, every building, every person, they were all waiting for something to happen. Or perhaps for someone to come and release them. But no one ever did. As Daniel wandered deeper into the town, the reality of it all began to sink in. The people weren't waiting for a rescue. They were waiting for a man who had never left, a man whose name was forgotten by time itself. The dark figure in the mural was not some distant being. It was him, his face, his body, his soul. The curse of Eaton's Hollow wasn't just a place, it was a loop. And Daniel, he was now a part of it. The town had a way of keeping you, of pulling you in, of making sure you stayed. No matter how hard you tried to leave, the road would always lead you back. The curse of Eaton's Hollow was eternal. The people were stuck. And now, so was he. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel's reflection in the glass of a nearby shop window grinned back at him. It wasn't his smile, though. It was the town's smile, twisted, waiting. Story number 2. Whispers in the Attic. The old house sat on the edge of town like a forgotten memory. A house that had seen too many years, too many seasons pass by, and too many lives come and go. The Tallman family didn't care about its age or history. To them, it was just a house. A big one, sure, but a house with room to grow. The kind of house they could make their own. David and Emma Tallman, along with their 8-year-old son, Nathan, moved in just as the autumn leaves started to fall. The house, a Victorian beauty, had high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a large, spacious attic that David was eager to turn into a storage space. Nathan, however, was drawn to it for reasons he couldn't explain. There was something about the attic that felt different. Not the good kind of different. The first night they spent in the house, Nathan couldn't sleep. The walls groaned in the quiet of the night. The old house settling into its new life, but there was something else. A whisper? At first, Nathan thought it was the wind, something that was just a product of an old house. But the sound was too clear, too purposeful. Nathan lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in his chest. The whispers came from above, the attic. They were soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. They would stop for a few seconds, then start again, just a little louder. "Who's up there?" Nathan whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He wanted to scream, wanted to run to his parents, but he was too scared. They had already told him to stop being afraid of things that weren't real, of things that only lived in his imagination. He didn't want to be the kid who couldn't handle a little noise in the dark. So, night after night, Nathan kept the secret to himself. He could hear the whispers, growing clearer with each passing night. Words began to form, like a language he almost understood. A name, a plea, a sorrowful whisper that lingered in the air. One evening, after weeks of restless nights, Emma noticed how pale Nathan had become, his tired eyes never leaving the attic door whenever he passed it. "Nathan, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days." "It's nothing," Nathan mumbled, shaking his head quickly. But Emma wasn't convinced. She looked at David, her brow furrowing. "David, do you hear anything strange? In the house, I mean." David shook his head. "You're just imagining things. Old houses make noises. It's normal." But Emma wasn't so sure. She'd felt it too, that strange presence, the subtle unease that hung in the air when the house grew quiet. Something wasn't right. She knew it. That night, the whispers came again, louder than ever before. Nathan's heart raced. He couldn't stand it anymore. He got out of bed, pulled his covers tightly around him, and crept quietly down the hall, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up at the door, which was slightly ajar, just enough to let the whispers escape. "Mom, Dad, please," Nathan whispered, but there was no response. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open slowly. The air inside the attic was thick, cold. The dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows across the old furniture and dusty boxes. It felt wrong. The whispers were no longer soft murmurs. They were voices now, urgent and frantic, as if they were calling to him, begging for him to listen. Nathan stepped inside, his heart pounding, and that's when he saw it. On a dusty old trunk, partially hidden behind a stack of old blankets, was a weathered leather journal. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed with age. Nathan picked it up, the whispers growing louder, almost frantic. He opened the journal carefully, flipping through the fragile pages. It was written in ink, neat but old-fashioned. The entries spoke of a family, the Williams family, who had once lived in the house. As Nathan read, the story began to unfold. It was a tale of betrayal, of a man who had killed his own brother for the inheritance of the house. The journal's final entry spoke of something far worse, the curse that bound the family to the house, a curse that would not let them rest until they were avenged. Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he read the final line. "We are trapped here forever, until the one who wronged us is made to pay." The air in the attic grew colder. Nathan's skin crawled as the whispers grew into screams, voices from the past pleading for justice, for someone to finally break the curse. The attic seemed to come alive, the shadows stretching and moving as if they had a life of their own. Terrified, Nathan ran downstairs, clutching the journal tightly in his hands. He burst into his parents' room, shaking with fear. "Mom! Dad! We have to leave! We have to leave right now!" David sat up in bed, confused. "What's wrong, Nathan? What happened?" "Please, you have to believe me," Nathan cried, holding the journal out to them. "The house is alive. It's cursed. The whispers. They're from the people who died here. They're trying to tell us something." David and Emma exchanged a glance, both skeptical, but then the house groaned, a deep, rumbling sound from within the walls. The air shifted, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath. David stood up, taking the journal from Nathan's hands, flipping through it. His face went pale as he read the same words. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the attic door. The whispers were getting louder, now echoing throughout the house. Suddenly, they weren't just whispers. They were voices, all around them, urging them to listen, to understand the pain that had been trapped in the house for so long. The Tallman family, for all their efforts, would never be able to leave the house. Not now, not ever. They had become a part of it, bound by the curse of betrayal and vengeance. The whispers in the attic would never stop, and neither would they. Story number 3, The Mirror Man. It started innocently enough, as most things do. Mia was just 12 years old when she first noticed something strange about the old mirror in her bedroom. It wasn't a fancy mirror, not one of those ornate gilded frames you'd see in magazines, or in the homes of people who cared about such things. It was just a regular mirror, plain and simple, with a thin wooden frame that had started to chip at the edges over the years. It had been in her room since she was a little girl, hanging on the wall across from her bed. Mia never thought much about it, not at first. She'd use it to brush her hair, to check if her school uniform was straight, to make sure there was nothing stuck in her teeth. The mirror was just a tool, something you don't give much thought to until it starts acting strange. It happened one night when she was getting ready for bed. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair before turning off the light. As the last brush stroke moved through her hair, she noticed it, something just a little off. Her reflection. It didn't follow her movement right away. For a split second, her reflection stayed perfectly still, its face frozen in the same expression Mia had been wearing moments before. At first, Mia thought it was nothing. She shrugged it off, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. But then, it started happening more often. She'd walk past the mirror, and sometimes, just for a fraction of a second, her reflection wouldn't mirror her. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone else to notice. But Mia did. She began to get the creeping feeling that something was wrong. The first time it really scared her was when she was brushing her teeth. She looked into the mirror, seeing her own reflection, the same as always. But then, something changed. Her reflection grinned. Mia hadn't smiled. In fact, she hadn't even moved. But the reflection, it smiled. A wide, unsettling grin that didn't match the rest of her face. Mia dropped her toothbrush. It fell to the floor with a loud clatter. Her heart began to race as she backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The reflection stayed there, still smiling at her. It was as if it was mocking her, playing some kind of twisted game. From that moment on, things only got worse. Mia noticed that the reflection was no longer content to simply stay in the mirror. It began to change, to grow bolder, more independent. When Mia would look away, her reflection would keep staring at her, its eyes following her movements even when hers didn't. It was as though it was watching her, waiting. She couldn't escape it. At school, it was fine. In class, at lunch, playing with friends, there was no sign of the reflection. But as soon as she stepped into her bedroom, the mirror seemed to pull her in. The whispers started after a few weeks, soft and almost inaudible at first, like someone was speaking behind her. But when she turned, there was no one there. It was only the mirror. Only her reflection. Then, one evening, it happened. Mia had been standing in front of the mirror, brushing her hair again, when the reflection suddenly stopped mimicking her. It wasn't a mistake this time. The reflection stared back at her, its eyes wide and dark, its smile slowly stretching, more menacing this time. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, as if studying her. Mia's breath caught in her throat, as the reflection raised one hand and slowly, deliberately, pressed it against the glass. The glass. It moved. It wasn't just the reflection anymore. The mirror itself began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Mia stumbled back, her hand shaking as she reached for the door, her mind racing for some explanation. There had to be one, right? She was just tired, imagining things. But no, it wasn't just in her head. She turned to run, but the reflection didn't stay behind. It followed her. It was like it had a life of its own, a will separate from her own. Every time Mia glanced into the mirror, the reflection was there, but different. It grew darker. The smile grew wider, more sinister. Sometimes it looked like it was about to reach out of the mirror, as though it was trying to crawl into her world. Mia couldn't take it anymore. She had to tell someone. But who would believe her? She was just a kid after all. She'd be laughed at, called crazy. So she kept it to herself, retreating into her room at night, hoping it would stop. But it never did. It only got worse. One night, after the whispers had become impossible to ignore, Mia's reflection did something it had never done before. It spoke. The voice was cold, distant, yet familiar. "Let me out," it whispered, its lips not moving in sync with Mia's. "Let me out, Mia. You can't stop it. You can't stop me." Mia's heart raced, her throat tightening in terror. "What do you want from me?" she whispered back, her voice shaking. The reflection's eyes darkened, turning black like oil. The grin was now a gaping mouth of jagged teeth. "I want everything. I want your life. I want your world." Mia stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. She had no idea what she was dealing with. She had no idea what it wanted. But one thing was clear: it wasn't just a reflection. It was something far darker, something that wanted to take her place. The next day, Mia did what any scared, desperate child would do. She smashed the mirror. The sound was deafening, the glass cracking and shattering as it fell to the floor. For a moment, the world stood still. Then the whispers stopped. The house fell silent. But Mia didn't feel safe. She knew, deep down, that the reflection was still out there. It hadn't been destroyed. It was just waiting. And someday it would find its way back. Because it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something far worse. Something that would never let go. Story number 4. The Light Beneath the Earth. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. The kind of weekend getaway where you leave behind the noise of the world, pitch a tent, and listen to the wind rustling through the trees. A chance for 4 friends, Danny, Laura, Mike, and Rachel, to reconnect, away from work, away from their busy lives. None of them had ever been to the old Whitley Woods before, but they'd heard the stories. Local kids told tales of strange happenings in the woods, about the odd lights that appeared on dark nights, glowing from deep beneath the earth. Most of them brushed it off as just that. Stories. Something to scare the younger kids. But deep down, there was always a little part of each of them that wondered if there was more to it. They'd laugh it off, of course, but every now and then you could see the doubt in their eyes. When they arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees. The air was thick, almost oppressive. The kind of air that clung to your skin and made you feel as if something was just out of reach, watching, waiting. But the 4 friends were excited, eager to set up camp. They pitched their tents by the stream, built a fire, and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kind of stories you tell when you're sitting in the dark, the crackling fire, the only light around you. The night passed slowly, peaceful, as the stars began to fill the sky. But then, about an hour past midnight, they saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, like the glow of a lantern in the distance. But as they stared, it grew brighter. The light was coming from the trees, from the far side of the woods, and it wasn't like any light they had ever seen. It wasn't a flashlight or a campfire. It was too soft, too otherworldly. It pulsed, glowing faintly, like a heartbeat, calling them. "What the hell is that?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. "Maybe it's some other campers," she said, though her voice didn't sound too sure. But Danny, who had always been the curious one, stood up, his eyes fixed on the light. "I'm going to check it out," he said, already taking a step toward the trees. "No way," Rachel said quickly, grabbing his arm. "It's probably nothing. Just stay here." But Danny wasn't listening. The light had drawn him in like a moth to a flame. "I'll be right back. Stay here," he said again, more forcefully this time. The others exchanged nervous glances, but they didn't follow. They stayed by the fire, watching Danny move through the darkness, disappearing into the trees. The night seemed to stretch on forever as they waited for him to return. The fire crackled in the silence, the glow of the light still visible in the distance. The minutes ticked by like hours, and just when they were about to give in to worry, Danny reappeared. "I found it," he said, breathless. "You guys need to come see this." Laura and Rachel exchanged a look, concern etched on their faces. "What is it?" Rachel asked, standing up. Danny didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked back into the woods, the others following him reluctantly. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows thicker, as if they were stepping into another world. The light grew brighter, now shining through the trees, but it wasn't just light, it was something else, something alive. It pulsed, glowing brighter and dimmer in rhythm, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living thing. They followed it for what felt like miles, but when they finally arrived at its source, they stopped short, frozen by what they saw. It was a hole in the earth, a gaping tunnel that led deep beneath the ground. The light was coming from within it, faint and eerie, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The walls of the tunnel seemed to shimmer, as though the earth itself were breathing. "What the hell?" Mike whispered. Laura shook her head, her mouth dry. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't right." Danny was already stepping closer to the edge, peering down into the dark opening. "I think we should go in." "No!" Rachel shouted, grabbing his arm. "Are you crazy? We don't know what that is." But it was too late. Danny had already dropped to his knees and was peering down into the tunnel, his face illuminated by the eerie glow. He didn't hear Rachel's protest, didn't feel the unease settling into the pit of his stomach. "Danny, come on," Laura said, pulling at his sleeve. This is wrong." For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The light pulsed faster, brighter, like it was feeding off their fear. Then, without warning, a sound came from the tunnel. It was a low hum, almost like a voice, but it wasn't a voice they recognized. It wasn't human, it was deep, resonating from the earth itself, and then the ground trembled. At first, it was a slight shake, nothing more than a vibration beneath their feet, but then it grew stronger. The earth shook harder, the light in the tunnel flaring wildly. Something was coming from within, something ancient, something alive. Danny's eyes widened, his face frozen in a mix of fear and awe. "What is that?" Before any of them could answer, the light exploded outward, a blinding flash that seemed to consume everything around them. They stumbled back, covering their eyes, but the light kept coming, filling the space, pushing them back, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The tunnel was silent, the light was gone, and all that remained was the deep, empty darkness. They turned and ran. The woods were no longer the peaceful place they had come to earlier. Every tree seemed like a looming figure, the shadows twisting, bending in ways they couldn't understand. They couldn't escape fast enough. The feeling of something chasing them, something they couldn't see but knew was there. By the time they made it back to camp, the sun was rising. The light was gone, the woods were still, but none of them spoke of what had happened. They packed up their things in silence, the memory of the tunnel, the light, the force beneath the earth, burning in their minds. They didn't speak of it when they left, and they didn't speak of it years later, when the memories faded and the woods grew quiet again. But some stories are never truly forgotten. Some lights, once seen, can never be unseeped from the soul. And the thing beneath the earth? It still waits, deep in the shadows, in the silence, for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander too close. Story number 5. The Returned. It was the kind of thing you never expect to happen to you. It always happens to someone else, some family you hear about on the news, some face you'll never meet, and you tell yourself, that's terrible, but it could never happen to me. But then it does. It was a rainy Thursday when Ryan died, the kind of day that felt heavy in your chest, when the sky was too dark and the streets too slick, and everything seemed like it was being swallowed by the storm. Tom Michaels, a father just trying to make it through another week, was at work when the phone rang. His hand shook as he answered. "The hospital," the voice said. "Your son's been in an accident. It's bad." Tom didn't need to hear any more. He knew the moment he picked up the phone that his world had just shattered. His son, Ryan, just 15 years old, was gone. The days that followed felt like a blur. The funeral, the wake, the endless condolences. Tom went through the motions, trying to keep his mind from unraveling. But nothing ever felt the same after that. The house was quieter, colder. Ryan's absence pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. Every time Tom walked through the house, he expected to hear Ryan's laugh, or the sound of his footsteps, or the soft hum of his favorite songs playing through the speakers. But the silence was all that remained. Then, one evening, 5 months after Ryan's death, Tom's world was flipped again. It was late, nearly midnight, when Tom heard a knock at the door. He had been sitting in his living room, staring blankly at the TV when it came. A single, hollow knock. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone. His first thought was the police, or maybe one of those people who had never stopped trying to comfort him. But when he opened the door, he found no one standing there. But there was something on the doorstep. A small package, a cardboard box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Tom bent down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. There was a faint odor to it, something that reminded him of wet earth. He didn't think much of it. Maybe it was some kind of sick joke, maybe a sympathy gift from a neighbor. But when he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a tattered photograph of Ryan, the same age he had been before the accident. The picture was worn around the edges, the colors faded. It was an old picture, one from his first day of high school. But the moment Tom touched it, his pulse quickened. Something felt off. The photo looked like Ryan. It even smelled like Ryan. But the eyes in the photo were wrong. They were too wide, too vacant, too knowing. The door creaked behind him. Tom's head snapped up, his stomach sinking. Slowly, his heart racing, he turned. There, standing in the doorway, was Ryan. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, sure he was seeing things. But no, it was really him, Ryan. Standing there, smiling, his hair the same, his clothes the same, like nothing had ever happened. He was even holding his backpack over his shoulder, just like he used to do when he came home from school. "Dad?" Ryan said, his voice so familiar it made Tom's heart twist. "Are you okay?" Tom stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out. "Ryan? Ryan, is it really you?" Ryan's smile didn't falter. "Of course it's me, Dad." Tom's hands trembled as he pulled his son into an embrace. He felt warm, solid. His son, his flesh and blood, back from the dead. For a moment, Tom thought he might be dreaming, might be hallucinating. But Ryan felt real. His arms were strong. His hair smelled like it always did, like fresh shampoo. Tom squeezed him harder, as if trying to convince himself this was no illusion. But as the days passed, things started to change. At first, it was small things. Ryan would stare off into space for hours, his gaze distant, unfocused. Sometimes when Tom would call his name, Ryan wouldn't respond. It was as though he couldn't hear him, or didn't want to. Then came the way he looked at people. Ryan's smile, that warm, familiar smile, started to change. It was subtle at first, a little too wide, a little too sharp. He'd laugh at things that didn't make sense, or He'd get angry over the smallest things, over nothing. His temper was quick, and when he snapped, his eyes would darken, almost like they were full of something other than his son. Something older, something darker. One evening, after dinner, Tom sat across from Ryan at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it all. Ryan had been quiet, but there was something in the air, something that made Tom's skin crawl. As he stared at his son, Tom's mind raced. This wasn't right. His son was back, but he wasn't the same. "Ryan," Tom said, his voice shaking, "is there something you're not telling me?" Ryan's smile remained, but his eyes, those eyes. Tom felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean, Dad?" Tom's throat tightened. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. You're not my son, are you?" he whispered, barely able to speak the words. "You're not." Ryan's smile stretched wider, his teeth too sharp now, too perfect. His eyes, dark and empty, glinted in the dim light. "No, I'm not," he said softly. "But I'm something that used to be him. I'm something far older now, and I've come to take his place." Tom recoiled, his heart thudding in his chest. The room felt colder now, the air thick and choking. The thing that had once been his son reached across the table, its hand cold and clammy, and placed it over Tom's. "You shouldn't have welcomed me back," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of Ryan's. "Now you'll never get rid of me." Tom stood up, backing away, his mind spinning in panic. The thing that had once been his son was no longer the boy he loved. It was something else, something dark and hungry, something that had been waiting to return. And now it had taken everything from him. It had taken his son, and it would take everything else. The house was silent now, the walls closing in on him. Tom knew in that moment that he was trapped. The thing that had returned was not human. It was something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right time to rise again. And now that time had come. Story number 6, The House on Hollow Hill. When Hannah Crawford inherited her late aunt's estate, she didn't know what to expect. The letter had come as a surprise, a simple envelope with her name scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting. Her aunt had always been distant, living in that old house on Hollow Hill, the kind of house you heard about in whispers, the one kids dared each other to approach on Halloween nights. But now, the house was hers, and Hannah had no choice but to go. The house stood at the edge of town, a grand but weathered mansion perched on a lonely hill that overlooked the valley below. As Hannah drove up the winding road, she felt a knot form in her stomach. The house seemed to grow larger the closer she got, like it was waiting for her, watching her approach with an eye that wasn't human. The trees that surrounded the property were old and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the wind carried a mournful howl that rattled the windows of her car, but she didn't turn back. She hadn't known her aunt well, but the inheritance meant security, a fresh start. The house was hers now, for better or worse. The first few days were uneventful. She spent most of her time unpacking, sorting through old furniture, and trying to make the house feel like a home. But something was off. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, shifting and settling in ways that didn't seem natural. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just the age of the place. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, as though it were alive, breathing in rhythm with her own heartbeat. It started with the footsteps. At night, when the house was quiet, Hannah would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps, as if someone were walking from room to room. But when she checked, the hall was empty. At first, she told herself it was just the house settling, but the sound was too consistent, too real. The footsteps always started at the same time, just after midnight, and they always stopped at the same spot, right outside her bedroom door. Hannah didn't sleep that first week. She lay in bed, listening to the sound of those footsteps, feeling the weight of something invisible pressing against her. It wasn't just the noise, though. It was the feeling, the sensation that something, or someone, was standing just beyond her reach, watching her, waiting for something. The shadows came next. One afternoon, while Hannah was in the kitchen, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement, a shifting in the dim light that filtered through the windows. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She shrugged it off, but it happened again the next day and the next. The shadows seemed to dance across the walls, twisting and contorting in ways that didn't make sense, moving with a purpose, as if someone was walking just out of her sight. Every time she looked, they disappeared, but the feeling of something lingering remained. It was the old mirror in the hallway that finally pushed her over the edge. She had never liked it. The mirror was large and ornate, its silver frame tarnished with age, and it was placed in the hallway in the spot where it caught the light just right. The reflection was always a little off, like it didn't quite match the real world. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, Hannah walked past it and stopped. For a split second, she thought she saw something move in the reflection, something behind her. But when she turned, the hallway was empty. The next night, she was woken by a noise, a whisper, low and indistinct, like someone was calling her name. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, but the room was silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the house settling. Her breath came in short bursts as she looked toward the door. The footsteps had started again, but this time, they weren't just upstairs. They were all around her, closing in, moving through the hall, down the stairs. Hannah bolted out of bed and ran toward the source of the noise, toward the hallway, toward that damn mirror. As she passed the old cracked glass, she stopped. In the reflection, she saw herself, but she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, just out of reach, was a shadowy figure, its face obscured in darkness. She spun around, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, stretching on forever in the dim light. Something was wrong with this house. Something had always been wrong. The house had a history that her aunt had never spoken of, but one that was now unfolding before her eyes. Hannah began to dig into the old records, the papers her aunt had kept in a dusty chest in the attic. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The house had been in her family for generations, but it hadn't always been a home. A tragedy had taken place there years ago, a dark event that had haunted the family for decades. Her great-grandfather, a man with a temper that could flare at any moment, had killed his wife in a fit of rage, and the story didn't end there. The murder had been covered up, hidden behind a veil of lies and secrecy, but it had never truly stayed buried. The house had kept its secrets, and now those secrets were waking up. Hannah felt the weight of the house closing in on her. The footsteps, the shadows, the whispers, they were all tied to something that had happened here, something that hadn't been put to rest. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the sins of the past, by a tragedy that had never been acknowledged, never been dealt with. One night, as she sat alone in the living room, she heard a soft voice. It was familiar, though she couldn't place it. The voice whispered her name, just loud enough for her to hear. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one. Then, the mirror. She couldn't stop herself. She walked toward it, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. In the reflection, she saw herself, standing tall and unafraid, staring into the glass. But as she looked closer, she saw something else. In the corner of the reflection, half hidden in the shadows, stood the figure of a man. The same man from the stories, her great-grandfather, his face twisted with rage and regret. And then she understood. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison for those who couldn't escape the past. And now, Hannah was trapped too. The footsteps never stopped after that, the shadows never stopped moving, and the house, with all its old, painful memories, continued to watch her, just as it had watched everyone else who had come before. The house on Hollow Hill had claimed another soul. Story number 7. The Cemetery at Midnight. It started out as a dare, as most things like this do, the kind of dare that gets passed around the group like a lit match, each friend trying to show they're braver than the last. It was just a stupid game. Or, at least, that's what they thought. The group, Alex, Rachel, Sean, and Lisa, had all grown up together. They'd spent summers riding bikes through the woods, stealing cigarettes behind the school, and daring each other to do things they'd never admit to their parents. But tonight, things were different. Tonight, they were standing at the gates of the old cemetery on the hill. The cemetery was no secret. It was the one place in town that everyone knew was off limits. There were stories about it, stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. Stories about the people who were buried there, the ones who died under strange, tragic circumstances. The graveyard was known for its haunted past, a past that made even the most skeptical people uneasy. "You're not scared, are you?" Alex said, looking at the others with a smirk. His words came out more confident than he felt. He'd heard the stories too, about the shadows that moved between the gravestones, the cold spots in the air, and the ghostly whispers that never seemed to stop. But he wasn't about to back down now. Rachel, always the bold one, gave a laugh. "It's just a graveyard. People sleep there. They don't wake up." Lisa shivered but tried to hide it. "I don't know, guys. This place doesn't feel right." Sean, who was always up for a challenge, grinned. "Come on, it's just one night. We'll be fine." None of them were prepared for what happened next. The moment they stepped through the iron gates, the temperature seemed to drop. It wasn't just the chill of the night air. It was a deeper, more unnatural cold that seemed to settle in their bones. The moon was full, casting an eerie light across the old gravestones that stretched out in every direction. Some of the markers were weathered and cracked, names barely legible, while others had sunk into the earth over the years. The wind was still, so still it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. They set up camp near the old mausoleum, the largest structure in the cemetery. It had been abandoned for years, its iron gates rusted shut, and the walls covered in creeping ivy. They joked, laughed, and told ghost stories, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that was creeping up on them. But the further the night stretched on, the more the atmosphere seemed to press in around them, as though something was watching, waiting. Then, at midnight, it began. At first, it was small, a movement in the corner of Rachel's eye, a flicker of shadow between the gravestones. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She shrugged it off, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the others felt it too. A heaviness in the air, a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate in the earth beneath them. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone. "I think we should leave," Lisa said suddenly, her voice tense. "This isn't fun anymore." Alex laughed, though his voice was tight. "It's just the wind. You're fine." But then it wasn't the wind. They heard it. A low, guttural moan, echoing through the cemetery. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the distance, but it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from right behind them. Rachel stood up, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble, like the earth itself was shifting. The cold intensified, seeping into their skin, making it hard to move, hard to breathe. The air turned thick, oppressive, and the quiet hum grew into a full-throated growl. Then the shadows moved. At first, it was just a flicker. The shadows between the gravestones seemed to twist, like something was shifting just out of view. But then they stretched, reaching toward the group, and from the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were not people. They were something else. Ghostly figures, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes hollow and black. They moved slowly, gliding over the ground, their limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Each step they took seemed to echo in the night air, a sound that chilled them to the bone. Sean backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. "We need to get out of here, now!" But the figures were closing in, faster than they should have been able to move. Their mouths opened wide, their teeth jagged and sharp, as they drew closer and closer, their hands reaching out to grab, to pull. The group turned to run, but the cemetery seemed to stretch out endlessly before them. No matter which direction they went, the gates never seemed closer. The dead were everywhere now, swarming around them, blocking their path, whispering in a language that didn't belong to the world of the living. Rachel screamed as a cold hand grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadows. Alex reached for her, but the figure vanished, leaving nothing behind but a thick, suffocating fog. Lisa was next. Her scream was cut off as she was dragged into the darkness, her body swallowed up by the graveyard. Alex and Sean were the last ones left. Running, stumbling through the graveyard, their breath ragged, hearts pounding. They could feel the dead closing in, could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They reached the mausoleum, but the door was locked. The shadows pressed against them, pulling at their clothes, at their skin. In a panic, Sean grabbed Alex's arm, his voice shaking. "We can't outrun them, we can't." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadows faded, the cold lifted, and the graveyard fell silent once more. Alex and Sean stood in the dark, gasping for breath, their bodies covered in sweat, their hearts still racing. The dead were gone, but they could still hear the whispers, faint and far off, as though the cemetery was still calling to them, still hungry. They didn't speak to each other on the way back. No words were necessary. They knew what they had seen. They knew what had hunted them. The dare was over. And as they left the cemetery, they swore never to speak of it again. But deep in the shadows, the cemetery still waits, still hungers, and every midnight it calls to those foolish enough to enter. It calls to those who dare to trespass. Story number 8. The Black-Eyed Child. Jacob Harris had lived in the old farmhouse for 10 years. It was tucked away at the edge of a small, rural town, surrounded by miles of dense woods and empty fields. The kind of place where people didn't knock on your door unless they needed something, and where the silence at night was so thick you could almost hear the earth breathing. He'd always enjoyed the solitude, the quiet. It gave him time to think, to work on his writing, and to get away from the noise of the world. There was something peaceful about the isolation, but lately something had started to change. It began with the children. It was the first day of autumn when Jacob first saw them. He was sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the overgrown yard, when he noticed a figure standing by the edge of the trees. A child, dressed in ragged clothes, staring at the house. Jacob blinked, sure he had imagined it, but when he looked again, the child was still there. Their face was pale, their posture stiff, and their eyes dark, too dark. Black, no whites, just black. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He thought maybe it was a trick of the light or some kind of optical illusion caused by the fading afternoon sun. He told himself it was nothing and turned away from the window. But when he looked back, the child was gone. Over the next few days, Jacob saw them again, the same child, and then more of them. Sometimes they were in the yard, sometimes by the trees, but always near the window. Always staring. Always with those eyes, black, empty, like the space between stars. At first, he thought they were just kids from the nearby town, lost or playing some game. Maybe they'd wandered too far from home. But something about them made him uneasy. They didn't move like normal children. Their heads didn't tilt when they looked around, and their movements were stiff, almost mechanical. As the days passed, the number of children increased. They began to gather near his house, standing in clusters like a dark shadow, creeping closer and closer. Jacob started locking the windows and doors at night, but that didn't help. They would appear outside, staring into the house, their faces frozen and unblinking. It wasn't just the eyes anymore. The air around the house felt heavier, thick with something Jacob couldn't explain. He felt it when he woke in the middle of the night, when the silence seemed to press against his chest, suffocating him. He started hearing things too. Low whispers, like voices carried on the wind, soft and unintelligible but unmistakable. And sometimes, when he ventured too close to the window, he could feel their eyes on him, cold and watching, waiting. One evening, after hearing the whispers grow louder, Jacob could no longer ignore it. He grabbed his flashlight and walked outside, determined to confront whatever was happening. The children were gathered near the trees again, as they always were, standing in a perfect line like they were waiting for something. They didn't move as he approached. "Hey!" Jacob called, his voice shaking despite himself. "What do you want?" There was no response, no movement, just those eyes, those black empty eyes. His breath hitched in his throat as he stepped closer. "You can't just stand here, you're scaring me." He reached out, grabbing one of the children by the shoulder. But the moment his hand made contact, a cold, sickening feeling washed over him, like ice had been poured into his veins. The child's head snapped around too quickly, too far, and Jacob recoiled in horror as he looked into the face of the child. It wasn't a child at all, not anymore. The face was pale, the skin almost translucent, and the black eyes, they weren't human. They were endless, deep, and full of something that wasn't alive. Jacob felt his heart race, his blood go cold. The air around him seemed to press in, suffocating him. He let go of the child, stumbling backward, but the others didn't move. They just stood there, staring. Then the whispers began. Louder this time, like they were inside his head. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in his mind, a warning, but he didn't understand what it meant. Why were they here? What did they want from him? Panicking, Jacob ran back to the house, locking the door behind him. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. These weren't just children, they couldn't be. There was something wrong about them, something ancient. And then, in the deepest part of his gut, he realized the truth. They weren't children at all. They were spirits, or something worse. And they weren't just haunting his property, they were hunting him. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He sat up in the living room, staring at the windows, waiting for the next movement, the next sign of the children. His mind was reeling. He had to understand what was happening, what he had unleashed. There had to be an answer. There had to be something he could do to stop them. He scoured the house for anything that might explain the presence of the children. And finally, in the attic, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers and forgotten boxes, he found a journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. It spoke of a curse, an ancient evil tied to the land, something that had been buried long ago. The children were the result of an old ritual, a sacrifice made to keep something worse locked away. But over time, the evil had started to seep out, and the children had returned, seeking new victims. Jacob felt his blood run cold as he read the last entry in the journal. The children will come for you. They will find you. And when they do, you will be the one who becomes their servant, bound to the earth forever, watching as others take your place. Suddenly, the whispers outside the house grew louder, more frantic, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he realized the terrible truth. He had become part of something he couldn't escape. The children weren't just haunting him, they were waiting for him to join them. He ran to the window, but as he looked out, the children were gone. For a moment, there was silence. But then, something moved in the dark. Something was watching him. Something had already entered the house. The door creaked open slowly, and Jacob could feel the darkness creeping in, suffocating him, pulling him into the past. The house was no longer just his home. It was a prison, a place where the dead still walked, and where he was now a part of their cursed world. He heard the whisper again, right behind him this time. "You shouldn't have stayed." And then, the black eyes stared back at him, closing in from all sides. Story number 9. The Haunting of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was the kind of town that didn't make the news. Nestled between the hills and forests, it was a quiet, sleepy place where people knew everyone's name, and secrets were harder to keep than gossip. It wasn't the kind of place you'd think of for strange occurrences or mysterious deaths, but that's exactly what happened, and no one knew why. It started with old man Chet Lawson. He was found dead in his rocking chair, the kind of death that's as peaceful as you can imagine. Only Chet's face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. No sign of a struggle, no cause of death, just the horror in his eyes. People brushed it off, blaming it on his old age. But then, the next week, it was a local teacher, then a young woman, then a father of 2. Each death more bizarre than the last. No one was safe. Detective Tom Avery, a man who had seen his fair share of crime in his years with the state police, was sent in to investigate. Willow Creek had always been a peaceful place, but the deaths were piling up. At first, Tom thought it was just bad luck, some sick streak of coincidences. But the more he dug, the more he began to feel there was something wrong. Something that went deeper than just random misfortune. The bodies kept piling up, each person found in their home, their face contorted with fear, their cause of death undetermined. The town was on edge. Rumors spread like wildfire. The local tavern became a place where people whispered of curses, witchcraft, and things better left forgotten. One evening, Tom sat in the back of the town's tiny library, flipping through dusty old records and news clippings, looking for anything that could explain the deaths. It was there, buried deep in the archives, that he found it. A story that had been buried for generations. A story that most of the town had forgotten, or tried to. Back in the late 1600s, Willow Creek had been the site of a brutal witch trial. A woman named Eliza Moreau, a healer who lived at the edge of town, had been accused of witchcraft by the townspeople. The trial was quick, the accusations unfounded, and Eliza was burned at the stake, her body left to rot in the town square. The trial and execution had been a dark chapter in Willow Creek's history, but the town had moved on, burying the past as best they could, or so they thought. The more Tom read, the clearer it became. The deaths, the fear in the eyes of the victims, they weren't random at all. They were connected. Each person who died had a distant connection to someone involved in the trial, or at least to the Moreau family. It was as if the wronged spirits of Eliza and the others who had suffered through that trial had returned, seeking revenge. The spirits were angry, restless, and they weren't going to stop until they had taken their toll. Tom couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something ancient and terrible that had been awoken, something that had been buried for far too long. He visited the old church, the site of the trial, where the spirits had been condemned, hoping to find some answers. The church had been abandoned for years. The roof caved in, the windows shattered. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew, but there was something else, something colder. As he walked through the remnants of the church, his flashlight flickering in the dark, Tom found a small, hidden room beneath the altar. Inside, a stone crypt lay open, its lid cracked, as if something had recently tried to get out. On the walls of the crypt were strange markings, symbols he didn't recognize, etched deep into the stone. Tom couldn't explain it, but he knew he had found something important. The air grew colder, and then he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. "Help me." The voice was thin, desperate, like someone who had been buried for too long. Tom's heart raced as he turned around, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, and he realized, too late, that he wasn't alone. The spirits of those wronged during the trial were there, in the shadows, watching him. They had always been there, waiting, and now they had found someone to blame. The next day, Tom's body was found in his apartment, his eyes wide with terror. His cause of death was the same as the others, no physical signs of injury, just that haunting, frozen expression of fear. He had become the latest victim of the curse that had haunted Willow Creek for centuries. It didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, more people died. More fear filled the streets, and the townspeople began to realize that no one was safe. The whispers of the past, the anger of the wronged spirits, had come to claim the town. Eliza Moreau's vengeance wasn't finished. The spirits of the past were still hungry for retribution. The people of Willow Creek tried everything. They prayed, they sought the help of mediums, even tried exorcisms, but nothing worked. The curse was too old, too powerful. Each time someone tried to stop it, the spirits grew stronger. In the end, Willow Creek was abandoned. The streets grew quiet, the houses empty. The town had become a ghost town, left to rot, just like the spirits who had once walked its streets. It was a town no one spoke of anymore, a forgotten place buried in the shadows of history. And the spirits, they still haunt the place, still wait for the next soul to cross their path. The curse of Willow Creek will never be broken. It's a town doomed to live in the past, forever haunted by the ghosts of those who died seeking justice that never came. The last few deaths were just the beginning, and it will never stop. Story number 10. The Crying Woman of Old Creek Road. There are roads in every town that people talk about, roads where strange things happen, roads that you're warned to avoid after dark. Old Creek Road was one of those places in Maple Grove, the kind of road that gave off a certain kind of chill, even on the warmest nights. The locals called it the Curse of Old Creek Road. They whispered about it in hushed tones over dinner, around campfires, or while sitting on their porches watching the sun go down. It wasn't a road that anyone traveled at night if they could help it. The story was always the same. A woman, dressed in white, wandering the road, weeping for her lost children. According to the legend, she had lived in a house at the end of the road years ago. Her children had drowned in the creek after she'd sent them out to play. Distraught and unable to live with the loss, she had wandered down the road every night, searching for them, her cries echoing through the trees. And if you drove down that road at night, they said, You could hear her sobbing and sometimes see her standing at the side of the road, calling out for her children. But most of the people in Maple Grove had stopped believing in the legend. It had become just that, a story passed down from one generation to the next, something to scare the new kids or make them think twice before venturing out too far at night. But not everyone believed. Jake Simmons, a man in his late 30s, had lived in Maple Grove all his life. He'd heard the stories, of course, but he was no fool. He was a man of logic, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained. To him, the crying woman was nothing more than a myth, a local legend, nothing to be afraid of. One evening, Jake found himself working late at the auto shop. The sun had set by the time he finished up, and he was in no mood to make the long trip back home, so he decided to take the shortcut down Old Creek Road. It would save him some time, and honestly, he wasn't afraid of some old ghost story. As he turned onto Old Creek Road, the air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping by a few degrees. Jake shook it off, blaming it on the change in the weather. The trees that lined the road were thick and overgrown, casting long, creeping shadows that made the road feel narrower than it was. The headlights of his truck illuminated the path ahead, but there was something unsettling about the darkness beyond the reach of the light. It felt watchful. As he drove further, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the night was. There was no wind, no rustling of the leaves, no sounds of animals or insects. Just the low hum of his truck's engine. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. And then, he heard it. At first, it was soft, barely a whisper above the hum of his engine. But as he drove on, the sound grew clearer. It was the sound of crying, soft, broken sobs carried by the wind. It stopped Jake cold. His heart skipped a beat, and his grip tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe it was some animal, some wounded creature. But the longer he listened, the more he was sure. It was the sound of a woman weeping. Against his better judgment, Jake slowed the truck, his headlights cutting through the darkness. And that's when he saw her. Standing by the side of the road just ahead was a figure in white. Her long, flowing gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, and her hair, dark and wild, hung loosely around her face. She was hunched over, her hands clutched to her chest as she sobbed, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her grief. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He knew this was the woman from the stories, the woman in white. But something in the pit of his stomach told him this wasn't some legend. This was real. He should have turned the truck around, driven away, gotten the hell out of there. But instead, something inexplicable tugged at him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the human instinct to help someone in need. Against his better judgment, he stopped the truck and rolled down the window. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice shaky. "Are you all right? What's going on?" The woman's sobs quieted, and slowly she turned toward him. Her face was pale, her features distorted by pain and loss, and her eyes were wide and empty, black as night. Jake felt a cold chill run through him as he stared into those dark, soulless eyes. "I lost them," she whispered, her voice raw. "I lost my children. I can't find them." Jake didn't know what to say. He could hear her pain, her heartbreak, as if it was seeping through the very air. Something about the look in her eyes made him feel like he was sinking into a nightmare, unable to escape. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, the woman stepped closer to the truck, her voice growing louder, more desperate. "Please," she cried, her hands pressing against the truck window. "Help me find them. They're lost. I can't find them." The sobs that followed were so raw, so heartbreaking, that but Jake felt his chest tighten. His breath caught in his throat, and suddenly the air around him grew thick, suffocating. His hands shook as he fumbled for the gear shift, but the truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, refusing to come to life. The woman in white leaned closer to the window, her face now inches from his. Her breath was cold, like the chill of death itself, and her hands, pressed against the glass, began to leave smudges. Smudges that looked darker, thicker than they should. She whispered again, her voice lower, more chilling this time. "I need you to help me. You're the one who will bring them back." Jake couldn't move. He couldn't think. He was frozen, trapped in the gaze of her dark, empty eyes. He couldn't escape. The truck still wouldn't start. And as he looked into her face, the world around him seemed to fade away. It was as if he was slipping into the past, into the tragedy of her life, a life that had ended so long ago, but never really left. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The woman vanished into the night, leaving only the sound of her cries behind. When Jake's truck finally roared to life, he sped down Old Creek Road without looking back. He didn't stop until he reached his house, his heart still pounding in his chest. For days after, Jake couldn't shake the memory of the woman's dark eyes, her endless sorrow. He tried to convince himself it was all just a hallucination, a product of too much stress. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was something in Old Creek Road, something tied to the woman in white, something trapped in the sorrow and tragedy of that place. And no matter how much Jake tried to forget it, he knew he would never be the same. Because once you've seen the crying woman of Old Creek Road, you can never escape the weight of her grief. And maybe, just maybe, she was waiting for him to return.